This is Rodney Salisbury, and I play Robbie Robertson. And you're listening to Spider-Man the Animated Series podcast.
Hello webheads, and welcome to a very special edition of Spider-Man the Animated Series podcast, an unexpected Valentine's Day episode. Seeing that it is Valentine's Day today, I am your host Alex Robson, and unfortunately the co-host, Marvel artist Will Robson, could not join us today. He's currently in Brussels with his fiancée celebrating Valentine's Day like any good comic book artist slash Marvel hero would. Now, I would be celebrating my wife, but my wife is actually training to be an amateur pro wrestler, and she's currently taking bumps and pulling moves. So as it's Valentine's Day, I'm here by myself, and much like Peter Parker in Spider-Man Blue, the story by Tim Sale and Jeff Loeb, I'm alone recording and speaking to a microphone. And I'll certainly get into Spider-Man Blue later, considering it's about Valentine's Day and one of my favourite Spider-Man stories. So, to start with, this past weekend, my brother, my dad, and my wife and I went to the Star Wars virtual reality experience, which was great fun, and I won't talk about it in detail as I'll wait for Will to get back and talk about it on the pod. However, I bring it up because afterwards I went into a local DVD music shop that also sells graphic novels, and there on the shelves was Spider-Man Deadpool Serious Business, which of course was drawn by my brother, Will. So it was great, as always, to see my brother's art proudly displayed there on the shelves, along with my surname being attached to it. So yeah, very proud, and I urge all listeners to go out and pick up that book. It's certainly a great read. And apologies in the background, that was my dog shaking, so I'm sure we'll probably go for a lonely Valentine's Day stroll after this. And for anyone wondering, I will be celebrating Valentine's Day just probably tomorrow with my wife. So why am I doing this? Well, considering it's Valentine's Day, and Peter Parker has always had a very troubled relationship life, I figured we can go over that and review it. Of course, in the show, they do a great job at depicting that. But where do they get all those stories? Well, of course, it stems from the comic books, and I'd like to just go over some of the Valentine's Day fun that Spider-Man has brought to the general population, and then review my favourite Spider-Man comic book, especially being a Valentine's Day one. I thought it was quite pertainable to this episode, and it would be Spider-Man Blue. So, to begin with, let's talk about some Valentine's Day cards that I've been seeing, which are hilarious. Like Spider-Man swinging on the card cover saying, "You're amazing," and on the inside he's sticking to a wall and it says, "Stick with me." You can also find, "You make more than just my spider sense tingle," and he's doing a little love heart with his hands. That'd be great for a sweetheart. "I've caught you in my web, my Valentine. You are an amazing friend. Happy Valentine's Day." I thought this one was a bit harsh, because if you're going to send a friend card to someone, hopefully they know that they are a friend, because that's a hard way to let them know. You can also find, "Roses are red, just like my suit, and this spider thinks that you're really cute." There's a big old picture of Spider-Man on this card with his eyes massive, and it just says, "I've got eyes for you." It also says, "Face it, insert name here, you just hit the jackpot. Happy Valentine's Day. Let's stick together this Valentine's Day, just hanging around to say Happy Valentine's Day." So some really fun cards, I think. I love puns, as you all know, so those crack me up. I would probably give one or two to my wife and get the whole rolling eyes routine, but I had to share those. I also think it's fun because I was out seeing some Valentine's Day displays this past weekend, and Spider-Man was included in those as well. It's got the mask logo that's in the shape of a heart, and you can find that in pillows, toys, t-shirts, hats, cookies, and of course cards as well. So if you want to give your love or your sweetheart a little Spider-Man gift, then that's always a fun way to do it. So let's talk about Spider-Man's love life, shall we? We all know that he's had many loves, obviously Mary Jane being the one that everyone remembers, and knows the most. I mean, if you asked your grandmother or grandfather or any family member that may not know Spider-Man, if you say, hey, who does Spider-Man have as a girlfriend or wife? They would probably say Mary Jane, most likely because of the movies or just being exposed to that. But there's many people that are involved in his life, many women that have molded the man that he is, the hero that he is. Of course, the other one that everyone knows is Gwen Stacy, which is the highlight in Spider-Man Blue. I think that she's just as important as Mary Jane, and if we ever have John Semper on the show, I'd love to ask him why, or the reason why, he never included Gwen Stacy. I'm sure it's probably because, one, he wanted the focal point to be on Mary Jane. There was Felicia Hardy as the Black Cat as well. But it would be really great to kind of get some insight on that, and it would have been awesome as well to, at some point, if the show continued, maybe it went into season 7, 8, 9, they would have introduced Gwen Stacy into it. But of course her story was already done in the place of Mary Jane, with the Green Goblin on the Brooklyn Bridge and disappearing, or dying, but of course they couldn't say that. So we've got Gwen Stacy, as I said, Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat, we've got Betty Brant, we've got Deborah Whitman, and a few others as well that have come into Spider-Man's life and touched his love life in one way or another, and changed him or made him realise that being a hero and also being Peter Parker is a very difficult thing to juggle and to balance out. So before we go into Spider-Man Blue, which, as I said, is my favourite Spider-Man story, we can also talk about The Wedding, Spider-Man marrying Mary Jane, a comic that came out in 1987, the year I was born. And it was written by David Michelinie and featured cover art by John Romita Sr. It was also drawn by Paul Ryan, inked by Vince Colletta, and lettered by Rick Parker. It's a great story. It's really nice. It shows a balance of Peter being engaged to Mary Jane, and as he's pondering if he's making the right decision, so is Mary Jane. And Mary Jane is even approached by a long-lost love and offered 2 tickets to Paris to run away with him, as long as she doesn't marry Peter, which he has no idea. Eventually, they do get married after a whole story of Spider-Man fighting off villains and trying to figure out his love life and if this is the right thing he wants to do. And at the end of the episode, Mary Jane offers the tickets to Paris to Peter, and they both run off for their honeymoon and go to Paris. There is even a wedding dress designed for Mary Jane in this comic book. A comic book had a professional wedding dress designer whose name was Will Smith, strangely enough, and sadly he passed away soon after the book was released. But that wedding dress actually was a design created specifically for the comic book, and then I think later became an actual dress that you could buy, which is pretty amazing. And it was a big deal back in 1987. It was the relationship, the comic book love history between Mary Jane and Spider-Man finally coming to a point where they tied the knot and became official. They've also done a way of erasing this from the comic books later, far later, in 2007, where in an attempt to save Aunt May's life, Spider-Man was confronted by Mephisto, and both participants were single again, and that was the only way that he could save Aunt May's life, was by basically erasing his wedding to Mary Jane. So by the time it was present day and Aunt May was okay and alive, Mary Jane had no recollection or idea that she was in love with Peter and that they even got married, which of course is the typical tormented poor Spider-Man. In order to get one thing, he has to sacrifice another. They've made fun of it in other iterations of comic books as well. The wedding cover particularly is a very famous wedding cover. They did in Marvel Zombies #5, there's a cover which parodies the wedding. It depicts a zombie of Spider-Man holding Mary Jane's half-eaten corpse. And the heroes and the villains in the backgrounds are decaying, and Spider-Man's shaped heart in the background has a bite taken out of it as well. The Simpsons even shows a parody of the cover of the original comic book after comic book guy gets married. So definitely a big deal in comic books, a big deal for the character, and used quite often. But I'm here to talk about one of my favourite Spider-Man books, and as I said, if not my favourite Spider-Man story, which is Spider-Man Blue. Now, this book is done by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, who are an amazing team. They've done great work with Batman, the Long Halloween series, which is also Dark Victory, and oh god, I forgot the third book now that they did, so apologies for that. But Tim Sale's art, Loeb's style of writing is just an amazing combination. They of course did other ones with Captain America and Daredevil, and they put their stamp on these characters. Even though they used recycled stories in a way, they put their own twist, their own spin, and it's just beautifully written and drawn. All of those I urge you to go out and pick up, but Spider-Man Blue in particular is probably my favourite of theirs, even over Long Halloween, which I know when Will listens to this, if he does, he's going to smack his head. But it's true, I think that it was like watching, well, it was like reading a long episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series. And it's the reason that we love the show so much is because John Semper took from these books and baked it into the stories of the show and made it, well, what it is today, which is why we do a podcast. It's just so good. So for anyone that hasn't read Spider-Man Blue, spoilers, because I'm going to talk about it extensively and go through. There are 6 books that run in this issued story, and I would advise going and reading it for yourself to really enjoy it and immerse yourself back into some classic Spider-Man writing and art before then listening to this podcast. But if you don't care and think I don't give a shit, I just want to know, then you're going to hear me go through the whole thing in some detail and also just give my thoughts on it. And for all those that have read it, then I hope you enjoy this as well. So let's kick off, shall we? So to begin with, let's talk about Jeff Loeb's simplistic yet complex writing. It's such a joy to read. It's so well balanced. He knows immediately how to get you to understand and relate to what the hero is feeling and what he or she is going through. And he never over-explains things, and he doesn't fill the pages with boxes and boxes of dialogue. He's been interviewed before where he likes the artist to tell the story and for his words to not overdo or overpower that art. He likes a great balance of art and dialogue, and he also doesn't like to overwrite what he says. Unlike me, who's over-explaining it right now, I really find that his words are so precise but so simple and meaningful that I just can immediately put myself in that situation. And it's the details that he adds that counts. For instance, he talks about Spider-Man in this issue, when he's remembering Gwen Stacy, about the way that she would flick her hair or the way that she would drink a soda. I mean, little things like that, that really humanizes it because it pinpoints tiny little things that become such immense details that stand out in your mind. Because let's face it, our memories, when we think about things that may be meaningful to us, but they are such minute little details in the grand scheme of that memory. And then we've got Tim Sale's art, which is just an utter standout and triumph. It is so unique and just one of my favourites. I know also Will took big influence from Tim Sale, as he said in previous podcast. He went out and he picked up the Long Halloween and he just couldn't put it down, and the art style just spoke to him in great volume. Tim Sale's characters and panel designs are very pulp, and they're very classic art in the sense of comic book art, but it also feels very film noir. There's a time sense to his art where, even though it is timeless, you can read one of his books and you don't know what time period it takes place. It's much like Spider-Man the Animated Series or Batman the Animated Series. They take a time period, but they don't make it that exact time period. They just take their favourite pieces out of it to set the scene and set the mood. His characters' faces are also distinctly different, and no one looks the same, and they all have different features, whether it be an exaggerated nose or eyebrows or a thin face, a broad face, a fat face. This all sounds quite simple really, but when it comes to art, I know from one being exposed to it through Will's art, and also just going down that rabbit hole of comic book art and reading and looking at all different types of artists and comic books, you can get into the same trope where a lot of people look the same. Tim Sale doesn't do that. He really does take his time to give each character their own distinctive look and feel. Their features are also slightly rubbery, especially the villains, and they're also very exaggerated. His character designs in Spider-Man Blue are particularly Steve Ditko influenced. You can look at his Peter Parker and go, that looks like Steve Ditko's Peter Parker. You can look at his Spider-Man, and the colours and the way Spider-Man moves and his eyes, it's just classic Spider-Man. But also his own Spider-Man and his own version. So the book, it opens on Spider-Man visiting the Brooklyn Bridge and leaving a rose for Gwen Stacy. Meanwhile, Peter is narrating and recording his thoughts on how they met and how they fell in love. So that's what I'm doing as well. It's recording through a microphone, so you have Peter talking about, is this thing on and is this thing working, and basically explaining that he knows that Gwen will never hear it, which is quite sad, as it establishes at this point Gwen is long gone, an untimely demise, but he hopes that one day someone who cares to know about her and his relationship will want to listen to this. He's also doing it, I think, and he doesn't say this, because he's still got such a broken heart over her death, and he blames himself. It's a therapeutic way for him to record his thoughts and feel like someone is actually listening to him, and he can vent out his feelings, because of course he can't just go to a therapist and tell them, hey, this is a big thing that happened to me and I'm trying to deal with it, because then he'd have to say, I'm Spider-Man. And he couldn't tell his friends, he can't tell Aunt May, he can't even tell Mary Jane, because the way he talks about Gwen, he has a lot of love and still has feelings for her, and of course that could make her jealous. So Peter then remembers fighting the Green Goblin one night, where they both knew each other's identities, so that's established already. Peter's in a chair, he's in his Spider-Man costume, his mask is off, and the Goblin has tied him up and is narrating, as any bad guy would, about how he's going to kill Spider-Man and make him suffer. Spider-Man obviously escapes from the chair, and after a fight there's a big explosion and Peter escapes with an unconscious Norman Osborn in his arms. The fire department then arrives, who picks up Norman Osborn, and as Spider-Man swings away, he tells the fire department that the Green Goblin is dead and Norman is the hero that saved Spider-Man. I particularly like Tim Sale's Green Goblin. It's probably my favourite iteration of the Green Goblin. He looks so menacing and mischievous. He looks like a green devil, but still, the way that he's drawn, it can still appear that it is a man wearing a rubber mask and a costume, which reminds me, strangely, of, if anyone that grew up in the early 90s, it reminds me of R.L. Stein's Goosebumps book, The Haunted Mask. It just looks like a character, or it looks like the Haunted Mask out of that story. And one of my favourite lines in this Goblin scene is the Goblin curses Spider-Man as he webs his arms to the wall, and he's caught up in it. And Spidey sings, catches thieves just like flies, as he quips and fights. I thought that was some great writing, and I can see Spider-Man singing his own song as he's taking down the bad guy. So Peter is then at the Daily Bugle after his encounter with the Green Goblin, and he's selling pictures of the event to JJ. Of course, JJ and him do their usual dance about, is it good enough? JJ kind of puts the pictures down, because of course he doesn't want to pay Parker a premium, but he then says, run the pictures to Robbie. Peter wants to get paid more, or at least wants to get his money up front. JJ says, no, I'm not some sort of bank account here or a trust fund. And Robbie then tells JJ that Norman Osborn has been admitted to a hospital and is probably going to wake up. JJ wants a photographer down there, but their only photographer that's available is currently covering the Tony Stark court case. That was a cool little Marvel Universe link there. I can just hear Ed Asner and Rodney Salisbury as these two characters whilst I read this comic book. They are just definitively those characters to me. And of course I hear Christopher Daniel Barnes as Spider-Man as well. So it was great to see a scene that was very much like the animated series in comic book form as well. So Peter volunteers to go and take a picture of Norman, as Harry is a school acquaintance of his and he can probably get in without a problem. But he wants to be paid up front for it, so JJ reluctantly agrees, and Robbie defends Peter as always as Peter leaves. Peter visits Norman in the hospital. As he arrives, he sees that Harry is there, and after being kind to Harry, and he reminds him that he should be grateful that he has a father and Peter grew up without parents, Harry thanks him for the really nice advice, and you can tell they're not really friends, and as Peter said earlier, they're casual acquaintances, and they're just getting to know one another. But as Peter leaves, Flash Thompson and Gwen Stacy show up. Flash is obviously not impressed that Peter was there and asks Harry, why is that loser Parker kid here? And Harry defends him and actually says, no, he's actually a good guy and you should give him a chance. And just as that moment, as Peter's walking down the hallway, he turns around and he locks eyes with Gwen, and he even says, that's the moment that I melted like a puddle, in his narration recording that he's doing this whole book. So we then cut to Peter and Aunt May in their kitchen, and Peter wants to impress Gwen and he wants to buy a motorcycle. Aunt May always thought he'd get a car, but she does remember Uncle Ben riding a motorcycle and how attractive and handsome he was, so she agrees. She then breaks out a Black Cat piggy bank, which I thought was a nice little tie-in with Black Cat there, and she breaks open the piggy bank and offers money that she's been saving and was saving when Ben was still alive, and offers it to Parker to go and buy a motorcycle. Peter buys the bike and he sees Flash and Harry and Gwen outside the shop being very happy as he decides if he wants to buy it or not. And that was the kind of the decision there, seeing how happy they were, made him realise, no, I'm going to do this for me. So he buys the bike and he pulls up alongside them and he impresses Gwen enough where she goes for a ride on the back of the motorcycle, and he feels so good in that moment, and he feels like the popular kid that gets the girl at the end of the story, and everything is going according to plan. We then cut to the house of Aunt May, where she answers the door and a shadowy figure of a woman is at the front door. Aunt May tells the shadowy figure that Peter is out but will be sad that he missed her. The figure replies, May, you can bet on it. And that's the end of book 1. Book 2 begins with another shadowy figure, this time a man, in a fur-lined coat, and he's breaking the Rhino out of prison. Tim Sale's Rhino, particularly amazing. He is a mammoth creature. I mean, I forgot to mention that Tim Sale and Jeff Loeb also do a Hulk story. They do Hulk Grey, Daredevil Yellow, this is Spider-Man Blue. They all had a colour reference. I believe it was Captain America White as well as another one they did. And this Rhino is like the Hulk, but he's just incredible to look at. It's such amazing artwork. So after Rhino is broken out of prison by this mysterious shadowy figure in a fur-lined coat, Peter is still trying to impress Gwen in science class, and Flash is even threatened by Peter as he sees that he's making progress with the girl that he's interested in. We then cut to Spider-Man fighting the Rhino as the mysterious shadow figure looks on from a rooftop. The Rhino then escapes, but Spider-Man picks up a piece of Rhino's hide and finds it peculiar and wants to figure out a way on how to defeat the Rhino, as he is encased in this impenetrable suit and he's such a force to be reckoned with. There's no way that Spider-Man can take him down just using his brawn. He's got to use his brains as well. So he takes it to good old Kurt Connors. It's established right off that Connors was the Lizard, but is now a trusted ally of Spider-Man. Connors finds that there is a mix of Rhino DNA and something similar to Kevlar or adamantium in Rhino's suit. It's self-replicating, much like the genetic mutation that brought about his own problems as the Lizard. So Connors agrees to help Spider-Man and figure out a way to defeat the Rhino, but is worried that it may set off his lizard that he's been keeping at bay for a long time. But for the safety of the city and innocent victims, he agrees nonetheless to help Spider-Man. So Connor goes off and figures out some form of how to defeat the Rhino. We then cut to Rhino and Spider-Man squaring off again, but this time Spider-Man brings along a special webbing that dissolves the Rhino's suit, leaving him helpless and vulnerable and defeated. It's pretty cool the way that this was done and drawn as well, because you slowly see the Rhino suit dissolve as this brown coated webbing that's almost like cement is sticking to him, and you see the actual person inside the Rhino suit who's really this fat little man. And Spider-Man even fat shames it at one point, which was a little too over the top, but he takes down the Rhino and defeats him. The shadowy figure is looking on from the rooftops and studying this battle. We then cut to Peter getting all dressed up in Aunt May's house and running down the stairs because he's off to meet Gwen. Aunt May comments on how nice he looks for his date with Mary Jane Watson. Peter doesn't remember agreeing to seeing Anna Watson's niece, but it's too late as the doorbell rings and Peter is stuck on a blind date. Peter narrates he pictured Mary Jane as the type of girl that has very nice friends who make soups and can knit, but all he can think about is how long it will take before he can go and see Gwen again, and that he'd hope she'd understand if he was a little late for their date. So Peter opens the door, and there's an amazing panel-by-panel tease of Mary Jane, as he's seeing Mary Jane, and they do a tease of her vivid green eye, just staring right at Peter. Then they show her lips, which have red lipstick on, and then finally a pan back of her as Mary Jane at the doorstep. And of course, as we just reviewed in the last episode review, face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot. Peter ends with a recording narration of, "And all at once, Gwen, I didn't think you'd understand at all." We go on to book 3. Begins with another reference to the Spider-Man song, where Peter's recorded narration starts with, "Okay, I can spin a web any size, I should be able to do this." And I really love how Jeff Loeb incorporates the reader into exactly what's going on. You don't have to read issues 2 or 1 if you're picking up book 3. He does a great job at giving you the exposition without just over-explaining everything again. He finds a great balance there, and you just go, oh, okay, so Peter's recording something and he's trying to figure it out, and then you're immediately on board with the story. So Peter then says, "You really can't tell the story about Gwen Stacy and how I fell in love with her without talking about Mary Jane Watson as well." And you really start to understand that Peter Parker, the kid that's always been a bit of a nerd and an outsider and never has had the popularity like Flash Thompson has or Harry Osborn has, suddenly is caught in a love triangle, or a web, between these two women. And he suddenly realizes it's not as cut and dry as guy meets girl, guy falls in love, guy gets the girl, and that's the end of the story. So Mary Jane is at a diner waiting for Peter, and she's meeting Flash, Harry, and Gwen for the first time. Peter claims in his narration that he wasn't sharing her off, but it certainly got Gwen a little jealous, and even Flash tries to hit on Mary Jane and is denied, which was great to see him denied, as he always gets what he wants, and MJ, the most desirable person there, shoots him down without an issue. So a news reporter then pops up on the TV as Peter arrives and warns everyone that the lizard has been spotted at Penn Station. Peter tells MJ he has to go so he can get a photo of the lizard for the Daily Bugle, and he tries to make that excuse so obviously he can leave and become Spider-Man and go fight the lizard. And MJ does agree, but she says only if she can come along, as it all sounds very exciting. So as Peter's riding his motorcycle there, MJ's on the back and she is having the time of her life, and you can see that she's quite a reckless person, the opposite of Gwen Stacy. She's a party girl, she loves to have fun, she's the kind of just go with the flow type of person, and she's all about living in the moment. So as they arrive at Penn Station, the place is surrounded by police officers, and Peter's wondering, how am I going to get rid of MJ and also get inside? But MJ, of course, the seductive person that she knows she is, and how she can use her looks to get what she wants, she goes up to a police officer and starts flirting with him and giving Peter enough time to sneak off behind the roped off area and go inside Penn Station. And Peter even realizes in this moment and recalls during his recording that MJ is always going to be the center of attention, and he wasn't quite sure how he felt about that at the time. He didn't like the type of person that always had to be front and center, because of course in his life as Spider-Man he's not always going to be able to be there for a woman that he's in a relationship with. He's going to have to go out and fight the bad guys, and they're going to have to be second best when it comes to the safety of innocent people in the city. So Spider-Man, now in costume, comes across Kurt Connor's family, his wife and his son Billy. Anyone that's watched or listened to the first episode knows that we found it quite funny the way that Lizard would say his son's name. Anyway, so he comes across the family, and the family has just come up from Florida because they were told by Kurt, come visit me, I've controlled the lizard, you don't have to be afraid anymore, it's safe, come back. Bad timing, because of course it's not. The lizard is free and loose again. So Spider-Man promises Kurt Connor's wife that he will find him and he will bring him back. And apparently Billy doesn't even know that his father is the Lizard and is completely oblivious to the whole thing. Spider-Man even wishes, as he's crawling down into the subway, that he could find a woman that cares that much about him no matter what happens to him as Spider-Man. She'll always support him. The Lizard then pops out of nowhere and starts to fight Spider-Man in the subway. He then gets control of Spider-Man and holds him in front of an oncoming train and explains to Spider-Man that the train's light that's coming should be perceived as evolution in action. Just as the dinosaur passed away, so shall the man that rule the planet now. The time has come again for the reptiles to return to their rightful place. And all I could think of is when I read this is that it's so The Matrix. There's a scene in The Matrix where Agent Smith is headlocking Neo just like Lizard is headlocking Spider-Man in front of an oncoming train, and he's talking about death and evolution. So I don't know, I should actually have looked when this book came out. So silly of me, I got so caught up in reading it that I didn't even think about those details. But I would love to know what came first, The Matrix or this, and who stole from who. So Spider-Man then breaks free in the nick of time, and the train splits them up as Spidey is on one side of the tracks and the Lizard is on another. Suddenly the shadowy figure from book 2 looms in the darkness and tells the Lizard to follow him, as they both want the same thing. They want the death of Spider-Man. The train passes, and by the time Spider-Man can see the other side, the Lizard is gone and he's left alone. So Peter goes back outside and thanks Mary Jane for her help. He has a bruise on his head from the altercation, and he explains that it was a close call, but he got some great photos. MJ kisses his forehead as a reward and calls him for the first time her guy, which of course in Peter's mind means, are we dating? Because Peter doesn't know how he feels about MJ yet, as he's still very hung up on Gwen. We cut to the Lizard in Connor's lab, looking through notes and trying to discover a way to replicate more lizard people, which is of course a classic Lizard story. All he wants to do is make bloody lizard people. So Spider-Man beats the Lizard and injects him with a cure right as his family shows up. And Billy still has no idea his dad is the Lizard, because by the time he comes in, there's his dad, he's okay, and Spider-Man's there to save the day, and Kurt Connors wishes there was a way to repay him, and Billy even says, how can you repay Spider-Man and give him something that he doesn't already has? He's got everything he could possibly want, which of course, to a kid, a superhero is a superhero, but to Spider-Man he's got loads of problems. We then cut to Peter going home on his motorcycle, and he finds Harry Osborn on his doorstep. Harry offers Peter a rent-free situation with an apartment that he has in the city that is owned by his dad, and he wants Peter to be his roommate. So Harry asks Peter also, as he's leaving, if MJ and Peter are just friends. Peter says yes, as he doesn't know how to answer yet, and Harry is glad as he wants to ask Mary Jane out. Then right as Harry is leaving, he tells him that this is all going to work out, especially because Gwen has been giving Peter the eye lately. And that reminded me of being a teenager and being told, when you liked someone as a kid and you were told that that person liked you too, it changed everything. And you could see Peter being like, well, what are you talking about? Wait, Harry, hang on. And Harry's already gone by this point. And of course, all he's left with is that little bit of information to go on. But that means a whole lot as a kid. So book 4, we've got opening with Aunt May asking Peter if it will be okay if she and Anna Watson moved in together, as she overheard Harry Osborn and his conversation and realised that Peter's going to be moving out, which he thinks he should do, and also that he shouldn't let Harry go out with Mary Jane, that he should go after Mary Jane, which is just so funny to see Aunt May playing matchmaker. She just can't let it go with Mary Jane, her best friend's niece, going out with her nephew. We then cut to a prison scene where Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, is choking on some food in a food hall, and he collapses onto the floor. Toomes tells a fellow inmate that he had a spare pair of wings half a mile under the bridge on the south side before he is carted off by a bunch of officers. We then cut to Aunt May going to see Anna Watson with Peter, and Mary Jane is there, but she's already leaving, and she hops into a car with Harry Osborn. Peter is told they're having a housewarming party once he moves in, and then Harry drives off with MJ. And Aunt May in this moment is once again hilarious, because she tries to scare Anna Watson by saying, you know Anna, I've never really liked that Harry Osborn very much, which is such a funny way of being like, guess what? That guy is trouble, but my nephew, he's a doll. He's a darling. He doesn't go anywhere near trouble. We then cut back to the prison, and the inmate we saw earlier who was talking with Toomes escapes in a laundry bin, classic, and finds a spare pair of wings that he was told about by Toomes earlier. The shadowy figure, still, we don't know who this shadowy figure is, appears again and reminds him not to forget about their deal. You become the Vulture, you have to take down Spider-Man. Inside Harry's new apartment, Gwen, Mary Jane and Flash play pool as Harry brings them some drinks. Spider-Man swings past the window in the snow, and Mary Jane and Gwen are talking about Peter in this very moment, which is kind of funny, as Spider-Man's outside swinging and Mary Jane and Gwen are already talking about Peter Parker and showing interest. Flash freaks out as he sees Spider-Man swing by. He's his biggest fan, and he tries and waits by the window to catch another glimpse of him. Peter narrates also how he felt almost sorry for Flash, as his biggest hero is also his biggest enemy in a way. He hates Peter Parker and has no idea that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are one and the same. So Spidey is then interrupted as he's swinging outside by the new Vulture. This new Vulture's name is Blackie Drago, and he is the escaped inmate that of course is being tasked with taking down Spider-Man. So Spider-Man is actually beaten pretty badly, and he falls onto a rooftop, and as he's laying there in the snow, and he looks pretty bad and rough, he thinks about how he's letting the whole gang down, and especially letting Gwen down, and what Gwen would think of him not showing up to his own housewarming party. Book 5 opens with Peter arriving at his new apartment and telling Harry he has a cold and wants to be shown to his bedroom. All the guests of the party have left, and Peter gives Harry an excuse as to why he wasn't there. Harry explains to Peter that his bed was made up by Gwen in case he got in late, which of course he did. Peter found that really endearing and sweet, and I did too. I mean, he's out there doing whatever Gwen thinks he's doing, and she took the time to make up his bed for him, knowing that when he got back in, he'd want his new bedroom all done up for him. Harry then talks about Mary Jane, and how she mentioned that Peter's job can be very dangerous taking pictures of Spider-Man. And Peter narrates how even though he hadn't dated either of these women yet, he didn't like Harry talking about both women in his life. Even though he didn't know the way he felt about them just yet, he knew he didn't like the way Harry was talking about them. He wanted to be able to make up his own mind first, before then Harry could then take one of them away from him. Inside the prison hospital, Adrian Toomes lies in bed and he waits for his death. He is then visited by the mysterious shadowy figure, and this mysterious shadowy figure offers him a cure for the poison that he was given in the food hall. Turns out that Blackie Drago poisoned Toomes, only to find out where his wings were in order to become the new Vulture. So Adrian of course agrees to being given the cure as long as he kills Spider-Man. That's what the shadowy figure wants. That's all he wants out of this story, is the death of Spider-Man. So MJ visits a sick Peter in bed, because after his fight in the snow, it turns out he did actually end up getting a cold, and he's not feeling very well. She brings him soup and takes care of him. And it's a really nice scene where they're exchanging for the first time some deep conversation about just who they are underneath the veil. I suppose Peter puts on a gimmick as Peter Parker, and MJ puts on a bit of a gimmick as this party girl, and there's more to her than that. As Peter asks MJ if she's dating Harry, she says he's a nice guy and all, but there's someone who I really want to be with. And as she's about to tell him, there's a knock on the door, and in comes Gwen. And Gwen comes in and interrupts their conversation. She came to read to Peter in bed and keep him company. She also came to read Huck Finn, which is Peter's favourite story as a kid that his Uncle Ben used to read to him all the time when he was sick. Gwen of course talked to Aunt May, who then told her about this story, which is why Gwen then tried to come in and spend a little time with Peter, a little alone time. So now he's got both women that he's interested in sitting on the bed. MJ and Gwen then start to throw some sass at one another, and Peter even says maybe it was my fever that kicked in or I was hallucinating, but he felt like they were fighting over him, which I thought was kind of funny. Peter then kicks them both out. He makes excuses, and they're not very happy about it, but off they go. And of course he's doing it to change into his costume and hop out and go and find the new Vulture. Spider-Man confronts the new Vulture, but also encounters the old one as well, as Adrian Toomes is back up and running in his costume. Spider-Man then fights both of them in mid-air, and these panels are beautifully drawn. I love seeing Spider-Man fighting mid-air and using his webs and his agility to take down the bad guys, as both Vultures are trying to fight him as well, and also fight each other. So during the fight scene, a large piece of concrete is knocked off a building and falls towards the streets. Flash Thompson is walking along the streets, and right before he's hit by this large piece of concrete, Spider-Man swings in and saves him. Of course, Spider-Man sees the irony in saving Flash Thompson, but then they've also done a really good job here. Tim Sale has drawn the cover to Amazing Fantasy 15 of Spider-Man swinging on that cover, holding a person under his arm, but in this case, it's Flash Thompson. Spider-Man swings back down after dropping off Flash, and he goes back to fight the two Vultures, who are still fighting in mid-air. He rips the controls out of Adrian Toomes' wings, and as Adrian Toomes is going down like a plane out of oil, he rides him into the other Vulture. And he even quips, "And that, gentlemen, is how you kill two birds with one stone," which I love a good pun, and I thought it was a good one. Two birds, being the Vulture and the Vulture, taking each other out. So during the fall, Spider-Man actually ripped a piece of his costume on a billboard as he crashed through it, which of course will come back later. We then cut to Peter pretending to be sick still as Flash is in his apartment, telling everyone about his encounter with Spider-Man earlier that day. Flash is so proud to be able to tell the story, but he also feels like that encounter changed him, and he decides he wants to join the army and do his bit as well. So the issue ends with the shadowy figure finding the torn bit of costume and then scouring the rooftops following the scent, and he arrives right outside Peter and Harry's apartment and looks in through the window and sees Peter, Harry, MJ, Gwen and Flash all standing there. If you can't figure out who the shadowy figure is now, sniffing and following a scent, it will become pretty clear in the next book, which we're about to dive into, book number 6. This issue starts with Peter talking about a dream he had, where it involved Gwen. And as he's narrating the dream, we also see the shadowy figure watching video footage of Spider-Man fighting and defeating the many villains he has that are named after animals. So you've got Scorpion, Dr. Octopus, Rhino, Lizard, and the Vulture. And he's studying the moves. And as he then stops on the last video, he prepares for the final hunt and jumps out the window. Still haven't revealed who it is yet, but I think it's pretty obvious by now. Peter is in his apartment with Harry, and it's Valentine's Day. Hey, Valentine's Day. Peter's looking at a Valentine's Day card that he received with a simple "Will you be my Valentine?" signed smiley face. Peter and Harry are hosting a party for Flash's going away and joining the army, sort of good luck party, and Harry asks Peter for his cologne. He's too lazy to go upstairs into his bedroom, and he also thinks that wearing the cologne of Peter Parker might bring him the same luck, as he's had two beautiful women lusting after him the whole time, and he just can't figure out how Peter does it. The doorbell rings and Peter answers. It's Gwen to begin with, and Peter is absolutely stunned at how beautiful she looks. She's wearing this fantastic black dress, and he is just amazed at the woman that he potentially loves, he hasn't admitted it yet, looks. So he goes to close the door, but a hand stops it, and MJ walks in, who's looking distinguishedly different, but equally as beautiful. So he is then so confused about which one he even likes more, and who he wants to possibly end up being with, if he's even lucky to be with him in the first place. So all the guests arrive, and as Peter is putting away their coats, he sees Harry talking on the phone with his dad. Apparently, Norman Osborn is out of the hospital, and he's feeling much better. Harry explains to Peter that his dad is actually on his way over, and he also seems particularly pleased to hear that Peter was at the party. So Peter is now immediately worried. The hairs even stand up on the back of his neck, and he thinks that possibly Norman Osborn remembers that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are one and the same. Now, earlier in one of the issues, I forgot to mention, he spent quite a few weeks going to visit Norman in the hospital, mainly pretending to go see Harry and form a friendship, or at least that's what he wanted Harry to believe. But his true meaning was, does Norman Osborn remember I'm Spider-Man? And after several encounters, he feels that Norman has no recollection of the event whatsoever and doesn't remember being the Green Goblin. We go back to Peter and Harry joining the party and joining their guests and sitting down and listening to Flash's speech. Flash, of course, talks about his endeavours and what he's going to do and the hero he wants to be in the army. And Peter sits particularly close to Gwen, and MJ notices this as well and doesn't look too happy. Suddenly the party is interrupted by Kraven the Hunter, our mysterious, shadowy figure. Kraven crashes through the window and immediately starts sniffing, and he's looking for Spider-Man, or in this case, his prey. Kraven, however, grabs Harry Osborn instead, and he leaps out the window with them. Peter is confused, but as he's running upstairs, he tells Gwen to call 911 and gives the excuse that he has to go get photos for the Bugle. He then wonders if Gwen or MJ ever bought that excuse. Kraven takes Harry high up on top of a bridge that's under construction and tells him that Harry has been nothing but a coward and that he's disappointed that he's not putting up a fight. Harry tells him you got the wrong guy and he's so confused, but Kraven knows his prey's scent. By now you've realised, and they even say it, Harry is wearing Peter's cologne, which has of course caused confusion with Kraven's senses, and he thinks that Harry Osborn is Spider-Man. Spider-Man then interrupts the fight and knocks Kraven down, and Kraven is now confused and doesn't understand, and Peter narrates that he never wore cologne again after that, and that Kraven's ego is so inflated that he could not admit he'd even made a mistake in the hunt, and instead Kraven never tried to pick up on Spidey's scent again. So I thought that was a kind of cool explanation, because if you think about it, if Kraven can do it once, he'll do it over and over again. But this book explains Kraven's ego got the best of him, and he never went down that road again because he knew that he'd made a mistake, but he'd never ever admit it. So Kraven fights Spider-Man, and Harry is caught in the middle. There's a great fight on top of the rooftops, on top of the bridge, and it's some amazing art once again by Tim Sale, and some great depiction by Jeff Loeb as Spider-Man's narrating what's going on. Norman Osborn then shows up in the construction elevator and crashes the fight. Spider-Man uses this distraction to his advantage, and he lands multiple punches to Kraven, and he takes him out, all whilst he narrates and thinks about the amount of dates, kisses, and good times he's missed because of being Spider-Man. He could have been with Gwen all of these times and gotten closer to her and formed a relationship, formed memories, but instead he was out being the good guy and taking down the bad guys. Kraven is then beat to a pulp. He explains that Green Goblin hired him to kill Spider-Man. Spider-Man tells him that the Goblin is dead, but Kraven says it doesn't matter, he always has to honour the contract. Norman Osborn is there, and he doesn't let on that he either remembers or has forgotten that he's the Green Goblin, but he certainly is breaking out into a sweat, and he thanks Spider-Man for saving his son, and he doesn't look good, so Harry grabs him and says, "You alright, Dad? Let's get you home." And by the time that he picks his dad up, who doesn't look very well, Spider-Man has swung off into the distance. Of course, we know that later on, Green Goblin does come back. He does remember that he's the Green Goblin. He does remember that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and he goes after Peter Parker's love life and tries to hurt him the most. So he kidnaps Gwen Stacy, takes her to the top of the Brooklyn Bridge, and as the Green Goblin and Spider-Man have a battle, Gwen is knocked off the bridge, and in an effort to save Gwen, Spider-Man shoots his web to try and stop her from hitting the water, but unfortunately the snapback from the web attaching itself to MJ and the sudden stop breaks her neck, and she dies. This is what this book is all about, is Spider-Man venting about how his relationship with Gwen, even though he loved her and he selfishly chose to be with her, caused her untimely demise. It's interesting to see the story before the story in this book, and that's what I love it so much, is to see Norman there, and Spider-Man obviously in his narration says, "Will you believe it, Gwen? You won't believe it," but Norman Osborn shows up. And it's a great read to then correlate the two and attach this as a little prequel to that very famous Spider-Man story. So let's go back to it. Peter Parker is now back in his bedroom. It's dark, and there's a knock on the door, and it's Gwen. Gwen comes in and reveals that the Valentine's Day card was from her. She then asks Peter to be her Valentine's Day date, and she kisses him. And that, of course, is the beginning of Peter's real decision where he's gone, I want to be with Gwen Stacy. She's the one that matters the most to me. We then cut to present day, where Peter is recording this story in the attic of Aunt May's house, surrounded by a bunch of boxes, and he's speaking into a microphone much like I am now. He thinks about how he tries to make sense of her death, and he blames himself for her passing. Peter remembers the night of Gwen's funeral, something that he's never told anyone before, where MJ came to see him after. He could tell that her funeral had changed Mary Jane, that she no longer was the life of the party. She had a real reality check on life during that moment, because she realized that they all lost Gwen, and consequences of life do happen. No matter if you live in the moment or not, it doesn't matter. Things leave ripples, and that left a big ripple for MJ. Peter then goes on to explain even more that he realizes that MJ couldn't have had a serious relationship with Peter if it wasn't for the death of Gwen. So even Parker admits that without Gwen dying, he would have never married Mary Jane. It would never have changed her. She would never have been more of a human being, and would actually take great effect on her emotions. So as he's explaining this to the recorder, and he's talking to Gwen, Peter is interrupted by Mary Jane coming into the attic. He asks her how long she'd been listening, and she replies, long enough. Peter apologizes to her and says he didn't mean for her to hear that. MJ says it's okay. MJ then asks him, Peter, will you do me a favor? Say hello for her for me, and tell Gwen that I miss her too. MJ leaves, and Peter explains to the recorder that he should get going. He just feels blue this time of year. Every Valentine's Day he remembers Gwen, and he wanted to be able to record his thoughts this time. So Peter then looks down at a series of photographs of him and Gwen, and as he looks at it, he says he longs for a time when a girl he once knew with an incredible smile and so much good in her heart made him think that life can be great. And that's the end of the story. Now, if you hadn't read it and you listened, please go out and read this. It's an amazing Spider-Man story. It's full of human emotion. Valentine's Day or not, it is about Spider-Man's love life. And let's face it, every time Spider-Man is done one way or another, he's always going to have a love interest, because he's a teenager. And what do teenagers always have? They always have someone that they're interested in. They want to experience life with someone. They want a partner. They want to feel love. They want to know what it's like. And that's just a hand-in-hand trope of Spider-Man. And this book, I think, nailed that. You've got both characters that meant the most to Spidey, and you see the struggle that Peter Parker goes through. Usually it's, I've got to be Spider-Man, but I'm also going to miss a date with Mary Jane, or I'm going to miss a date with Felicia Hardy. And I love that, don't get me wrong. I love Spider-Man balancing his responsibilities with his social life and his life of being a hero. But this one pulled on the particular heartstrings of someone that he loved dearly, and he had made his decision. He said, Gwen Stacy is the one that I wanted to be with. And unfortunately, he only got to spend a little bit of time with her in a relationship before she was taken from him. And it's not that MJ was second best. As he explained, he wasn't even going to be with MJ until he realized that Gwen had changed MJ into a better person through her death. Which is sad, but hey, that's the story of Mary Jane and Peter Parker, which is obviously the more famous one. But I definitely wanted to highlight that and not be a somber Valentine's Day, but just talk about love without sounding really cheesy, which it does. But yeah, I hope you're all having a great Valentine's Day out there. I'm certainly going to go off and celebrate tomorrow. But I figured for anyone that had a moment today and wanted to appreciate Valentine's Day a little bit more in the Spider-Man sense of fandom, then I hope you enjoyed this podcast. In other news, we have a very special guest, a voiceover actor of Spider-Man the Animated Series, coming on for an interview later on this week, so that episode should be going up next week. I hope Will is going to be able to attend this interview. It's the day he comes back from Brussels, so he may not be able to. Either way, we'll have a little introduction between him and I, and then listen to that interview, and then the usual closing and games we play, etc. Following after that, we'll go right back into the episode reviews as normal. I believe the next episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series that's waiting for a review is Dr. Octopus Armed and Dangerous, the introduction of Dr. Octopus in the animated series. And then we've got some more interviews coming up. We've got a particular artist, Nate Stockman, who's a Spider-Man artist for Marvel. He wants to come on the show and be interviewed, so I hope you enjoy that. And I hope you guys are enjoying this podcast. I mean, of course, it is about Spider-Man the Animated Series, and we love this show so much. But we wouldn't love this show and these characters without the comics and without the people that will influence them along the way. So we certainly want to bring those in and make those a staple of this show as well. For all those and our listeners that haven't yet, please visit us on social media. You can find us at STAS Podcast. That's Spider-Man the Animated Series Podcast, which you can search on Facebook or Twitter. Please feel free to message us or leave comments. You can stay up to date with images from discussions about recent episodes, etc. And just generally enjoy talking about Spider-Man the Animated Series. You can also email us at staspodcast@gmail.com if you don't have social media. And please, go on iTunes, rate, comment, subscribe. It helps us wall crawl up the charts and attract more listeners. I can't tell you how much leaving a comment or leaving a 5-star review, or hopefully a 5-star review, really helps us. It helps us get noticed, it helps us bring more people on from the show, more people involved in the comic book world, and just generally helps people find our podcast more when they're searching on iTunes. You can also find us on SoundCloud if you're not an iTunes user. So please do go check that out. And if you want to stay up to date with what Will's working on, you can find him on any social media. I think it's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Robson Inc. That's Robson INK. And you can even watch a recent live episode we did last week where we continued part 2 of his wall crawl to becoming a Marvel artist. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope I didn't bore you with just my voice only. I certainly urge you once again, go out and pick up Spider-Man Blue. It's a fantastic read, amazing art, and just truly feels like the animated series, but on paper. Well, that's all we got time for this week. Join us next week, where we'll be talking all things Spider-Man the Animated Series. Until then, I've been Alex Robson, and remember, with a great podcast comes great recordability.